Okay. Okay. Well, thank you to Morgan Grenfell, which I believe that's your last name, of corruptario.ca, a small independent media website that is doing some of the heavy lifting on getting stories about what's going on at Queen's Park and this the Ontario PC government to light. We're very glad to have you on because we're talking about topic of the summer, it seems, is the LCBO strike that's going on. So Morgan, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So we're gonna have a link to your article in our show notes for our listeners. They can go and read that on their own. I won't go into too much detail, but can you just maybe give a summary of what you found in kind of going into the who's who of the LCBO board right now in Ontario?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we originally wrote a story about 6 months ago when the Ford government announced it was going to pay the beer store to pay out early to have booze ready in convenience stores. So when we looked at, and the LCBO is actually in charge of all pricing of liquor in Ontario, even if it's at the beer store. So it was pretty relevant. And when we looked into the board, what we found out is that the makeup of the board really indicates where the LCBO is going. So the chair of the board is a gentleman named Carmen Negro. He's a developer. He was at the premier's table at Kayla Ford's wedding. He's also been the benefit of a number of MZOs, so the ministerial zoning orders that Team Ford has become very famous for. Um, Most importantly, though, he was also vice president of the PC Ontario Fund, which is the fundraising arm of the Ontario PC Party. And he's also the chair of the board at Ontario Place. So he's very front and center right now for two controversial issues for the Ford government. There's also on the board of the LCBO a woman named Claudia Hepburn. She was appointed to the board of the LCBO in 2021. She's actually a Weston. She's Galen Weston's first cousin. So Loblaws and the other big box stores really stand to benefit tremendously from these changes to the LCBO. So there's an obvious conflict of interest there. There's also, a couple of other, I mean, the board really is a reflection of a lot of Team Ford's activities. Another member of the board is a woman named Quinto Annabelle, a lawyer who was linked to Vaughan Working Families, which was a group that the RCMP was looking into for violating election laws against teachers in the election that Ford was elected in. So I think when you look at the makeup of the board and the decisions that the board has made, I think it was quite clear, even at the beginning of Ford's first term, with his indication in terms of buck of beer, that getting rid of the LCBO was a long-term goal. And as people have positioned it as selling the LCBO, I think it's more like giving away the parts of the LCBO that make the LCBO a revenue generator for the province. And I think that's what the workers are trying to indicate with their strike.
Well, I mean, I mean, I think what you're right is that the we're focusing kind of on the wrong aspect of this strike, and by all means, we're not saying that the livelihoods of the LCBO strikers should not be taken into account, that they should not defend uh, their livelihoods by any stretch, but it's kind of time for people to kind of take a roll back and kind of see the bigger picture. Now, the government's framing this just as allowing more choice to appear for Ontario consumers, that will see beer and wine in corner stores and convenience stores, which, on the face of it, I'm not really opposed to. I kind of like, uh, you know, I like the convenience factor, but in your article, you kind of go into that there's more to this than just the convenience of where to buy beer and wine in Ontario. You're basically saying, like, we're talking about the actual distribution of beer and wine, that
Absolutely.
who's in charge of that LCBO warehouse, essentially, that houses all the booze in Ontario. Who gets to distribute that now to retailers?
Yeah. And that's, I mean, the sticking point for the LCBO union has been interesting because their sticking point has been ready to drink alcohol. They don't
Mhm.
want ready to drink alcohol. being sold in convenience stores and big box stores. And that's interesting because what they're talking about really is the thin edge of the wedge. Because right now, hard liquor can only be sold by the LCBO or LCBO licensed distributors. So the lobby behind the big box stores is getting ready to say, once they have ready to drink options already for sale, well, why can we not sell the spirits ourselves because we're already selling products that include the spirits? So it's again this chipping away at the role of the LCBO to make it less relevant and also just less profitable for the province because those sales are going elsewhere.
I mean, I guess you could, yeah. I mean, the point that's relevant here, like even if you think that the way in which alcohol is sold in Ontario is a bit old fashioned, and the reason it's stayed in place is because it's a kind of a cash cow for the province, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even if you think that more sort of liberal policies would maybe be a good idea in sales of alcohol, how it's being done is kind of the problem, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
this is the typical kind of Ford way of doing things, and that there's a clique of buddies who are carving this thing up between them. So it's not about giving better service to consumers; it's about making your buddies rich.
absolutely. I mean, I absolutely, there's lots of debate to be had about the way liquor has been sold or has been sold traditionally in Ontario. But if the if the profits from the LCBO were to go away, I think it's like $2.6 million, $2.6 billion annually. So the Ford government has really not talked about how that revenue will be replaced. And in our view, it's part of a bigger pattern in terms of removing revenue streams for the province. I mean, one of the first things that was done was take away like license plate renewals. That generates revenue for the province that pays for infrastructure, healthcare, education. Same thing with the LCBO. I mean, it's not easy to replace a $2.6 billion revenue stream, but our thought is that really trying to, I mean, we've got this running joke that not really a joke, it's probably not funny at all, but that what Ford is running is sort of a classic mafia bust out campaign, right? Get inside the organization, strip it of its assets, strip it of its ability to generate revenue, and run up its debt, so that once the province has no revenue to pay for the common services, education, healthcare, infrastructure, corrections, that'll be handed over to the private sector to quote unquote save it. That's been very clearly the intention in healthcare and education, and making sure this revenue goes away, and that the provincial coffers don't hold that $2.6 billion anymore is, I think, part of a bigger play.
I mean, what happens next, do you think? I mean, do you think who's going to win this battle? I mean, we're in the position now where the staff are out on strike. It looks like the province has kind of dug in for a long fight. Um, uh, where is public opinion on this? And do you think that the unions, God, obviously we've seen the unions win these fights before, perhaps most notably with the teachers kind of being really striking some big wins against this government. But can a much smaller union with a much sort of narrower kind of interest group, if you like, managed to hold out against the province?
Mm-hmm. I think it's an interesting situation. I think I think with this, the timing of the strike is interesting, because I think when Ford came out with this video from his barbecuing at his cottage, and then there was an amplification of all of his cabinet on Twitter. I'm sure it was on Facebook too, with them, basically sharing scabbing advice. Right? Like basically saying, here's a way to get around the LCBO strike. Here are other places to buy your booze. I mean, that is intended to keep the strike going as long as possible. I would imagine that if Ford wants to call an early election, that the issue with big box stores and the LCBO is something he wants to deal with. It's a promise he needs to keep before he calls an election again, or else he won't have the support from the Retail Council of Canada, for example, that has lobbied for these changes. So I think I'm not a labor relations expert by any means, but I think what will help the LCBO union in this regard is that this seems like a shady deal on top of shady deals. I think in the context of the Science Center and the Greenbelt and the LCBO and the beer store, I mean, and I'm biased because I talk about corruption all the time and I talk about people in this space all the time, but I think even the average person is starting to raise their eyebrows and go, what is actually going on here? Because they just pile up. And there's absolutely relationships, right? I mean, I'm sure the LCBO issue is related to the Ontario Place issue, where you wouldn't have the same man as the chair of both. Like we wrote an article late last year that talked about all of the relationships between ex-staffers of Doug Ford and Therm, right? I mean, Therm in Canada is a collection of Beth-and-Falvey and Ford staffers. So there's a bigger grift to be uncovered there that I think people don't exactly understand what's going on, but I think they have a sense that there's something shady going on. So I would think that would work in the union's benefit. But as you said, it's a narrow, if people are only looking through it as a consumer, like through the lens of as a consumer, and if they drink and it's convenient for them to get their booze, they might not care about that this much. What they would care about, I think, is the provincial revenue part of it.
I might push back a little bit on that because I think the people might care to know who wants to take over alcohol distribution in the province. And your theory, and it's quite compelling, is that it's the Weston family, that they're positioned as retailers in this province. Obviously, I mean, they own Loblaws and I believe 25% of the grocery market in Canada,
and shoppers
as well. So the idea of, they have the infrastructure already to kind of, if the LCBO gets the slow death of a thousand cuts kind of thing, and Galen Weston or the Weston family comes in at the 11th hour and says, hey, you know what, we can just give us all the booze in the warehouse and we'll figure out how to sell it across Canada. Who knows? You might get like the Weston liquor or something. Who knows?
Yes.
Popping up because if it's privatized.
Yeah, it's just sorry, Joe, just interrupt you a second, just jump in, just think about this. In what other line of work do you appoint to the board of an organization a family member of its chief competitor?
Yeah, exactly.
So why would you put a Weston on the board of the LCBO? That makes
you only put
sense.
a Weston on the board to do what you've just described, right? I mean, the Loblaws has a huge infrastructure, distribution infrastructure of its own, right, to service its own retail outlets. The Ford government has already used Shoppers Drug Mart has a distribution of medicines to pharmacies all across the province. Ford government already used that distribution service to send vaccines to all other pharmacies that weren't Shoppers Drug Mart. So there's actually a precedent there that they are interested in that distribution business, because then there will be end to end in charge of it. Right, from pricing right out to distribution. So yeah, absolutely. I think that is the end game.
But I was just gonna say that's kind of the mission since COVID, right? There's just been COVID comes in, and the government has just been slowly handing over more and more government responsibilities to the Weston family.
Yeah,
they handed over essentially the distribution of vaccines to the Westons by saying, "Hey, go to Shoppers and get your vaccine."
And you notice other pharmacies were saying that they weren't getting vaccines from that distribution service. So basically, you're relying on Shoppers to effectively deliver it to all of their competitors as well.
Right. And so, they came over the distribution. So now it's like, well, okay, we can also hand out all the spirits, wine, and beer in the province. And like, I just don't understand what the love affair is with Doug Ford and Galen Weston, that it's just Galen Weston's got to be the one who solves all the problems of Ontario.
Well, I think they're everywhere, right? I mean, the Westons got fingers in every pie across the country, but definitely every pie in Ontario. And also, to be quite honest, I mean, Ford's company was a client of Loblaws, right? Decca Labels works for Loblaws. So there's, a whole host of new conflict of interest potential there. But I think there's so many ex-Ford staffers who are working in lobbying right now that it basically it's self-dealing, right? I mean, the lobbyists come in and ask for what they want, and generally, they get a yes. I think it makes it very easy for the Ford government. The policy is dictated by corporations and oligarchs and what they're lobbying for. And I think the Westons have been super successful in growing their businesses in healthcare, in pharmaceuticals, in medicines, and in groceries. I think they controlling all the avenues is typically the Westons' business MO.
Which is basically trying to create something akin to a monopoly in kind of three major walks of life.
Absolutely.
Healthcare, food, alcohol. Yeah, I mean I mean, and I guess as much as we've said on this podcast, we have a fairly bleak outlook on the chances of there not being a third Ford government following whenever the next election comes. There does seem to have been a major sort of turn in the tide of public opinion about Loblaws and about the Weston family and what's going on there. So I wonder if, is this something that can it blow up in the government's face? But I guess, I mean, the public perception is that there's no connection between the Loblaws company and this LCBO strike. It's more of,
yeah.
I would say that the public perception is, oh, here goes the union. We know those guys at the LCBO. They're pretty well paid. What are they complaining about? They're just scared that they're going to lose their monopoly. That's the kind of, and on a superficial level, that makes a certain amount of sense.
And you'll see, mainstream media parroting that as well, right? I mean, I think, you'll absolutely, all the streeters that you'll see are been cut to show, people talking about, well, they've got good union jobs. Yeah, absolutely. I think over the past 2 years, especially especially in the second Ford term, media has handed him all of his narratives on a platter, right? I mean, if you look at what the headlines have been over something like the Science Center, and those have been out and out lies from the Ford and the Ford cabinet. But when the media coverage about it is credulous about it, right? I mean, it generally gives Team Ford the benefit of the doubt, and I think that gives these fictions credibility, because people generally still believe, if they see it in the paper or on TV, that it's true, that there's some mechanism behind the scenes to have fact checked it and make sure that it's true. But I think there's slowly a change that way. I mean, even in my social circle, there's a lot of people who've said that, they've given up on CBC, they've given up on CTV, they've stopped reading the Globe, they've stopped reading the Star, because I don't think people feel like they're getting a real sense of the full picture.
To an extent, why we created this podcast. I mean, and I'm not going to compare ourselves to the CPC or any proper trained journalists who've been in the field for decades. I'm not going to, but we did want to provide a platform to do what it seems that the media is not doing, which is to ask the second question. It's like you learn about a story, you see that kind of superficial reaction, and then what we never seem to get is that next question, that slightly deeper dig. And it's not even a particularly deep dig. All you have to do is go and look at the board of directors of the LCBO.
Absolutely.
It's like, it's not
it's funny
science.
Because my husband and I, we're former journalists ourselves, so we do have that training. We had not worked in journalism for a while, but like you said, these people would say, how are you finding these things? I'm like, we're looking. Like, all of this is actually being done in the public view. Now, it takes some knowledge to put these pieces together to know who's who and what's what, but it's all happening in the open. But there's really been a desert in the media in Ontario about explanations of these things. You might see a story once about a headline about corruption, but then it's memory hold and you'll never hear from it again. And there's not really a lot of effort into connecting the dots to show how all of these quote unquote controversies are related. And I think that's what we were trying to do in what we're offering. I mean, we don't do any reading. That we'll never call up Team Ford and ask for a quote. And my joke is, if you want to cover Team Ford, you don't talk to them, because they'll never tell you the truth, even if you got a question, if you got an answer from them.
That's completely been our response. We have asked them many a time, come on the podcast, we'll ask you a question, but you're not going to get the softball, what's your favorite color kind of question. We're just, they just don't want to answer it. But I want to kind of jump in there and kind of zoom out a bit in terms of what the consequences of this is, because that's the question nobody's asking, like, who benefits from this strike? And the solution everyone comes down to is the privatization of the LCBO or privatizing liquor sales in this province. And everyone immediately jumps to, oh, finally we can be like America, because in America they have cheaper booze sales. And I kind of want to take an opportunity just to push back on that myth, because in February, I was down in Florida, went down to Florida for a bit of a vacation with the fam. And my wife and I said, okay, you know what? We're going to take advantage of some of these cheap booze deals. I'm going to buy a couple bottles of whiskey and a few other spirits. We're going to bring them back with us. And we went to shop around and we found like the pricing, when you take into account the exchange, I was like, there's no difference here. Like I can buy this stuff almost, like when we take into account the exchange, said, oh, and then you get into duty.
Yes. Yeah.
Like I was like, it's cheaper at the LCBO, and the selection wasn't that great. The only trade-off is, and I'll give the defense here, is that far south you get some more niche brand liquors, but that's only because they're so small they don't have the capability of selling this far north. That's the only, but that would be no different than some of the more niche craft distilleries or craft beer makers here in Ontario. They can't sell in the States, so it's it's a draw. But again, it's this idea of like we're going to save so much money. Beer and wine is going to be so much cheaper. And I'm rambling here a bit, but I've had some thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like, I think, especially when you think of the people who stand to benefit from this change, and it's largely big box, mostly Loblaws probably. They're not known in their monopoly position for dropping prices.
Right.
Right. I mean, if you look at the monopoly that they have in the grocery market and how that, I mean, to talk about, the Reddit boycott, for example, there's over 100,000 people in that group on Reddit. So no monopoly tends to, and it's funny because when the beer store deal was announced, the Retail Council of Canada said it was a win for the little guys. The Retail Council of Canada is Walmart, Loblaws, Metro, right? That is who stands to benefit. And I don't think there's any evidence that, given a position to charge whatever it wants, a company like Loblaws would make things cheaper.
Well,
That hasn't borne out in any other part of their business.
Like it's the distribution that we're talking about here. It's not the retail guys. It's not the beer and wine and convenience stores. It's the distribution that they really want. And we're just hitting it from a government monopoly to a Weston monopoly. And I think that's what people need to get through their heads here, is that we're not going to have the illusion of privatization, because you're going to see it in Circle K and Beck's and Becker's and 7-Eleven and those places. You'll see like a row of Budweiser and Coors, sure, but the pricing will not be that drastically reduced. If anything, I imagine it might go up a bit, because the Westons will control it. That's what they want. They want to be the LCBO.
Yeah. And I think in terms of like, corner stores and convenience stores, people who follow that market don't expect booze to be available there long. I mean, right now the convenience store lobby is really pushed to have it because they've lost a lot of revenue on lottery tickets and cigarettes. Like those were two really big revenue generators. But a lot of people who follow that industry say that they don't imagine many of those smaller stores will be selling booze for long, because it does put them at risk for more theft. It does bring in, it brings in, possibly people who've already been overserved to buy. And, convenience stores and small businesses are finding it hard to staff now. And having, and they often rely on younger people, maybe under the drinking age, to work in those stores. So I think after it's been positioned as a win for sort of the little guy in the convenience store, but at the end of the day, I think once it pans out, you'll really only see the booze being sold at the bigger box outlets for the most part.
I mean, where I grew up in the UK, obviously it's a very deregulated situation.
The offie, got to go to the offie.
Yeah, and the off licenses still to this day are, to a large extent, smaller businesses. You'll get specialist off licenses, and they're kind of like the cannabis stores that we have, and that they only sell alcohol. They specialize in that. And depending on the store, they select what they're selling, so they've got the wherewithal to go to smaller or to specialize in Scotch or to specialize in something else. So you get that, that's great for kind of small businesses and things like that. The corner stores will always, well, in my experience, they would be selling the kind of worst stuff at the highest prices.
Cans of Stella at the door.
Yeah. And then the big box stores, sell vast quantities of a restricted range. So yeah, that's not going to help Ontario wineries, or it's not going to help Ontario
No.
brewers, because they want the stuff that's going to sell by the absolute truckload at the
And
lowest
talking about
price
choice
possible.
too, I mean, one thing that hasn't really come up in the coverage is that right now the LCBO is the biggest bulk buyer of booze in the world.
Right.
So they get a very good price on what
Right.
they buy, which, you know, wouldn't be the case if that's all being negotiated separately. I think the LCBO is the largest range of purchaser of spirits too, right? I mean, they have a bigger stock list of wines, beers, and liquors than I think anywhere else in the world. So I think we've gotten, especially here in Toronto where the LCBO is close by to most people, I think people have gotten used to that whatever they're looking for, they're going to find at the LCBO, which I think absolutely, as you mentioned, will probably be less of the case when it's a bunch of smaller retailers.
Well, the other thing is, I mean, you're looking where trends are going, and if anybody, I mean, you were getting there, if you don't follow the liquor or alcohol industry, I'll say broader sense, cocktails are a big thing. They're starting to make a comeback. Hence the why the current strike is over the protection of this ready-made cocktail in the can beverage line. But they're making a comeback. People want spirits and mixers and what have you. The sale of alcohol online, though, is the next big thing. Like after COVID, a lot of people were like, "Well, it's great. I can go and send an order into the LCBO. I can buy bottles of tequila, whiskey, wine that my local store that's around the corner from me might not carry, but the warehouse
Mhm.
does. So I want to buy a bottle of that, and I don't have to worry about it. Oh, I have to order, and it has to, it takes 6 weeks to come into the store. I order it, 2 days later, it shows up in my mail. I charge my credit card. All's well and good.
Yeah,
And that's the future. Like if you've been on the LCBO app, it's a horrible app.
it is.
But again, investment in that could improve the service, and again, maybe even increase uh, service. Again, it's one of these things, like if you don't do the effort to kind of modernize your line, you're going to have
Yeah.
disgruntled customers.
And if you look at this board, I don't think this board has any interest in improving the services of the LCBO.
Well, why would they?
Right? I think they're the agenda of the people on the board is not to improve the LCBO at all, right? So you can see why they would let their competitors get ahead of them on digital sales for sure.
Well, to show it as a personal experience, I mean, this is my own personal experience. During COVID, I got a LCBO gift card for Christmas, and I said, you know what, I'm going to treat myself to a nice bottle of scotch on the gift card, but it was COVID. So I said, I'm going to go purchase it online. Guess what? You can't do it. You can't use the LCBO gift cards on the LCBO website.
Yeah.
That blew my mind. I said,
Yeah.
I remember calling their customer service people. I said, how do you do this? He said, I have no idea. This is stupid.
Yeah.
This is stupid. Like, you should be able to use the LCBO gift card on the website to get stuff mailed to you.
And I find there's a lot of that, like a lot of what gets chalked up to incompetence in the last couple terms of the Ford government is actually
Yeah.
not incompetence at all, right? I mean,
Right.
it's your intention is to knock down, undermine, and let it well, look at the sign center, right? Let it fall into disrepair. Right. So I think the LCBO is very similar because they can, customers will make the case just as you've made. Like, why would I be spending this money at the LCBO when if I want to buy it online and they won't even take an LCBO gift card? Yeah,
So, I
absolutely.
mean, just to sort of maybe, probably coming up on our time, but to maybe draw this out into the kind of bigger picture of your work at Corruptario. And obviously, you've been working in this field for a long time. You remember previous governments, and I'm definitely not fishing here for any kind of compliment to previous governments. Every government that's ever been is flawed. Every government employs their buddies, to be honest.
Yes.
But when you think back to sort of previous, either previous administrations or other administrations around Canada, how does this government differ in the kind of scale of corruption that you think you're seeing?
Well, I mean, this is not the first government interested in privatization, obviously. I mean, I think a lot of what Team Ford is doing is a continuation of what Mike Harris started. And a lot of people on Team Ford are people from Team Harris and also from Team Harper, right? I mean, there's a big continuity of the key players in this that have been around for a long time. I think in terms of the last Liberal government, they actually started privatizing alcohol, right? Like they were the first to move it into grocery stores. I mean, if you look at the same government, Dalton McGuinty was the first to start privatizing Service Ontario centers, right? And now you're seeing this issue with car theft, which I'm sure there's parallels there too. I think what is different about Team Ford in terms of corruption is that the system around them is also under narrative control. So for example, and we use this example all the time, like when Rob Ford was mayor and Doug Ford was in council, the Ford brothers boycotted the Toronto Star for years because it covered them, right? It sent reporters out and it covered them. Since the new ownership of the Toronto Star, I mean, our theory is that the Toronto Star will actually end up merging with Post Media eventually. And editorially, it's very hard to see the difference between them. So I think what's different about the Ford government is, the system has been conditioned to either not cover or look away from the corruption. Because for example, if the Wynne government was doing what the Ford government is doing with the LCBO now, the coverage would be completely different. It would be wall to wall. Right? People would be asking for her head, right? They'd
I'll
say
be
she
honest.
has to resign.
I'm just floored that nobody has, and this is complete credit to you and Corruptario, that nobody has just asked the question, what is the Weston family stake in this fight? Like the fact that they lead the board of the LCBO and say, how is this not a conflict of interest when their stores stand to directly benefit from
Yeah.
a strike? And I mean, that right there, right then and there, it shows there's a huge problem in how we're covering this story and how we're talking about this, and that the people who have the most to gain seem to be the ones directly manipulating the downfall of the LCBO.
Yeah. Yep. No, it's very hard to look at the bald facts of it and not think that it smells, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I think the reason that it's not covered is that Ontario absolutely runs on conflict of interest. We write about conflict of interest all the time, right? I mean, about the people who are lobbying who used to be in government themselves, former politicians making a fortune as lobbyists, peddling influence afterwards. And I think, if you look at the media industry, in the last 4 or 5 months, the transition of people who used to be reporters now working for marketing and lobbying companies has increased hugely. And you can't fault media for that. Like there are a few media jobs and people still need to, pay the bills. But I think then you have these friendly faces that people know and give some credibility to because they've seen them, reporting the news. And now they're mouthpieces for, corporations and lobbyists. And it makes it really hard for the average new content consumer to understand what the agendas at play really are.
I guess my last, Roland's right. We need to wrap this up a bit, but I guess the last question I have is: do you see an end for this strike before the summer's out? Like, are we going to have a dry summer where we just see picket lines outside the LCBO until Labor Day?
Yeah, I would guess. I mean, again, I'm not a labor relations expert, but I would guess. I mean, the timing of the timing of this announcement back with the beer store was aligned, right? So by August 1st, you'll see a lot more corner stores with booze, puts less pressure on the LCBO and less consumer support for the strike. So I think Team Ford is doing everything it can to keep the workers out as long as possible. That's, why the scabbing effort with the fact that they had 2 days later, they had an interactive map tool built that you could find other places to buy booze. Like they knew this was coming. It was pre-prepared. I
Well,
think
someone said to
they have
me,
a strategy to keep them out.
yeah, someone said to me, if I've only been so efficient during COVID with, providing locations of
For
vaccines and
vaccines, I know
stuff,
that was left to volunteers to do that, right?
Right.
Whereas,
exactly.
if it benefits Loblaws, it'll get done, overnight.
Uh, yeah, very disappointing. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I think it's really really interesting, and I think there's a wider picture here that we want to explore more certainly. So I hope we'll speak to you again in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. Mm.